Fisher, great to have you on board with us. Very honored to have with us in our studio here at AFR Talk, Dr. Judith Reisman. Dr. Reisman is a researcher and author, historian, and teacher. Probably knows more about the sexual revolution than any other scholar in the United States. She's currently a visiting professor of law at Liberty University School of Law, author of the book Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences. We're going to talk about this in just a moment. You can get more information about Dr. Reisman by going to her website, drjudithreisman.com. That's doctor as in D-R, Judith, and then Reisman is R-E-I-S-M-A-N, drjudithreisman.com. Dr. Reisman, welcome to Focal Point with Brian Fisher.
Thank you, Brian. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, it's great to have you with us, and you're here at our headquarters, and you're here for a specific reason. Give us a quick explanation of what brought you here to our headquarters.
Well, I was invited this time. The last time I was here was about 30 years ago when I was working on a major project and something that was being sent out by American Family Association by Don Wildman. It was the research I did for the Department of Justice, images of children, crime, and violence in Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler. And Don Wildman sent that little report out all across the country, and 7-Eleven shut down their sales of Playboy and Penthouse, and then so did mom and pop stores everywhere.
So you, Dr. Reisman, so you've been involved from the very beginning of the work that AFA has done in trying to protect our culture from some of these images and some of these influences.
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
Well, tell us a little bit. I want to get back into that, especially I want to talk about some of the pathologies that surround pornography. I want to get into that. But you were one of the first to provide some kind of corrective analysis of all of the stuff that came from Alfred Kinsey, that came out of the Kinsey Institute. And it's important because the material, the stuff that came out of Kinsey, from Kinsey and from the Kinsey Institute, was just considered as gospel by everybody. Everybody took it at face value. Everybody repeated the statistics. And so it had an enormous kind of influence, but a lot of it was extremely, extremely flawed. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think you're kind. I don't say flawed.
Well, see, I'm the radio host, so I have to be whatever. You're the guest. You can be as straightforward as you'd like.
Well, from a scientific point of view, it was fraud. It was not just flawed. Flawed would mean that that there were some accidental errors, that inadvertent, that sort of thing. Fraud, on the other hand, means that the research itself was constructed falsely and it was done deliberately to mislead and to lie. Yeah.
Now, one of the things, the 10% figure, that's still bandied about. People think that 10% of the population is homosexual. Even saw a poll recently that indicated that the American people think that 25% of the population is gay. So because it's talked about so much, because it's always in our face, we have this exaggerated sense of their presence in the population. So tell us where that 10% figure came from, why it is flawed, why it's wrong, why it's a fraudulent figure, and what the more realistic view would be.
Well, Dr. Alfred Kinsey in 1948 produced his book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. He was at Indiana University, had prestige because of that, and was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and attained a great deal of prestige because of that. His book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, included data not just on children, which I assume we'll talk about shortly, but which was fraud and crime.
Well, that got just plain old criminal.
More than that, yeah. But he also had a huge section on homosexuality in his book, in which he claimed, and he had what they called the Kinsey scale. And that Kinsey scale, if anybody goes on the web, they type in Kinsey scale, pictures, you'll get hundreds and hundreds of pictures of this Kinsey scale, various designs for it, in which the scale claimed that there was a 0 point at the bottom, a 6 point at the top, and that a diagonal line across, and that 10 to 37% of our population is homosexual, he said, and at certain points of time, and that really we're all bisexual, said Kinsey. And of course, the heterosexual was at the 0 point, and the homosexual was at the 6, a little subtle hint that the researcher himself had a very strong bias. And of course, Kinsey himself was indeed homosexual or bisexual, depends on how you want to look at it.
I understand too that a lot of the research he did, I mean, again, it wasn't a kind of sampling that would lead you to scholarly, reliable results, because wasn't he working primarily with inmate population?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, it's quite worse than that. Right after this book that I did, Kinsey Crimes and Consequences, the most recent one I've done is called Sexual Sabotage. And sexual sabotage, the whole first section deals with World War II and our guys and what we really were during World War II. And that was the attack that Kinsey laid upon the culture, that everything that we said we were during World War II, we really weren't. We were all licentious characters and so forth. And indeed, it turns out that what his aim was to destroy what was called the Judeo-Christian belief system and culture at the time and all the laws that went with it. And he, in order to do that, he used a population during World War II that was free, that was not in the service, because he couldn't talk to anybody in the service. So if you're looking at the entire body of his research that was conducted, 87% of that was conducted during World War II. Most of that, he had 1,400 sex offenders that he called normal American guys. He had prostitutes, male prostitutes. He had a large homosexual population outside of the sex offender population. And when you started to look at those data and actually analyze them, there was nothing random about it, there was nothing scientific about it, and there was no truth.
So he was trying to postulate certain theories about human sexuality,
Yes.
and project them as kind of normative on the culture, but he was working with sex offenders, he was working with prostitutes, he was working oversampling homosexuals, so there wasn't anything normal about his sampling.
No, in fact, I've often said if he wanted to title his book Sexual Behavior in the Deviant Human Male, that would have been okay. But he titled it Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and that wasn't okay.
Well, and I've read that there is such a thing as institutional homosexuality in the prison system where males actually will engage in that kind of sexual conduct while they're inside. When they get out, they revert back to conventional heterosexuality.
Yeah, that's also standard. And he used a huge population that was in prison because obviously they weren't they weren't serving. But it gets to be even more interesting because in this last book that I did, the research on the population that was in prison turns out to be the most vile group, because during World War II, the Army did allow nonviolent offenders in prison to join the Army. So the only prisoners that were left that he would have used would have been the worst, the dregs of the dreg. Yeah. Then that became human sexuality in American society.
Now, you mentioned he also, so let me go back to this, just close the loop on this. What do you think, in your professional opinion, is the best estimate about the percentage of our population that's homosexual today?
I'm asked that all the time. It used to be roughly 1.5% to 2%. All right, that's the data, and that was cross-culturally, and the data were very clear. However, as you point out, Brian, when we're talking about massive recruitment in the schools and in television and in entertainment and so forth, and the downreach into the children, I would say we're looking at a very strong probability of a massive increase in homosexual conduct. Yeah.
Well, you go back and look at the story in the Old Testament of Sodom and Gomorrah. And, at one point, we're told that all of the men of the city surrounded Lot's household. And so one of the things that tells me is that if the conditions are right socially, the percentage of those engaged in homosexuality can go up. It's not fixed. And I was struck just a couple of weeks ago reading a column, I think, in Queerty, which is a gay website, where there was a writer there. I don't remember exactly who he was, but he posted around their website and said, yeah, we are out to indoctrinate your elementary school kids, and we're out to recruit them.
Yes.
And he said, let's stop pretending, because that's what the pro-family community has been saying. Look, they're trying to infiltrate the school system. They're trying to indoctrinate, brainwash, and recruit. And we've had gay activists say, that's nonsense. That's terrible. We're just trying to educate. And this guy says, look, let's stop pretending. We are out to recruit your children.
That's been said several times by homosexuals themselves. And Camille Paglia, a very famous lesbian, has also said that very clearly. There is no question about that. And I've got that documented in both of my books, by the way, in terms of the the documentation for the recruitment activity. And their position is very clear and very reasonable, if you will. I mean, from their perspective, they are not making their own children.
They cannot reproduce, so they got to recruit.
And and that's what they've said along the road, and that has come from the top down. It's been the consistent pattern, but now it's increased so dramatically in the classrooms that, the recruitment is becoming increasingly successful.
And we got a couple minutes left in this segment talking with Dr. Judith Reisman, who is a currently visiting professor of law at Liberty University School of Law, author of the book Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences. Got about just less than 2 minutes left. You talked about some of the research that Kinsey did that involved children, and this is where he actually got into criminal behavior.
Oh, absolutely. Well, most of his behavior from a scientific perspective was criminal, but in terms of the actual hands-on criminal activity, he was a sexual psychopath, Kinsey, and he recruited people around him who shared his sexual psychopathology, and I don't say that without documenting it, obviously. But yes, we're talking about the sexual assault on children as young as 2 months of age for his research. 4-year-old child allegedly having 24 orgasms in 26 orgasms, in 24 hours, which is an around-the-clock experiment. These children fainted. They had convulsions. They screamed. They cried. I'm quoting him. They screamed. They cried. They wept. They struck what he called their partner. And he concluded that these children definitely enjoyed the experience. When I read that, I thought, my goodness, this man he fits the profile of a sadomasochistic pedophile. No one would say a thing like that about children and call that an orgasm. You would call that torture.
We got about 30 seconds left. Just ask you this last before we go to break. Is there, because Kinsey's still cited, he's still referred to, we had a movie about his life a couple of years ago. Is there anything in Kinsey's research that we can trust and is reliable?
Well, I don't trust anything the Nazis put out during World War II when they were dumping people in freezing cold water. No, I don't trust anything that was in that book. No, it was all for an agenda. The agenda has been achieved, and it's going on right now.
Our guest here is Dr. Judith Reisman, in the studio with us here at our headquarters, author of the book Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences. Dr. Reisman, visiting professor of law at the Liberty University School of Law. You can get more information by going to her website, Dr. Judith Reisman, REISMAN.com. Back with more with Dr. Reisman after these messages. Stay with us.